that. We actually stored information on mainframes, but we won't go back that far. But there's many reasons when you think about it that reducing or cleaning up the file shares makes a huge amount of difference. And we're going to talk a little bit about some of the risks associated with that. But when you think about it, if you walked into the office tomorrow and let's say you bumped into the CEO or your senior manager and they walked in with you and this is what you saw in the office, what do you think would happen? I think that CEO or that senior manager would be very, very upset if they saw this kind of mess laying around the office. And besides the unorganization or disorganization, it's a fire hazard. And there might be some papers or files with personal information when you started digging through these piles. And if this is what you saw when you walked into the office each day, don't you think that the organization would start to take action to clean that up? Well, what's holding companies back from doing that when we talk about file shares or all this unstructured content, these documents and files and old backup data and things like that? And when we talk about corporate file shares, we're talking about these shares that people set up to share information within their organization, or in many cases, when you join an organization, they will give you a file share for you to store information on. I know that happened to me when I joined my last company. About 2 or 3 days after I joined, I got an email and said, welcome, here's your file share and you can store whatever you want there. So as I mentioned, what keeps us from taking action on that if this is what those corporate file shares most likely look like? Well, one of the big challenges is it's out of sight. It's hidden. And if we try to explain what these corporate file shares, where all this mix of information is being stored, some of it's redundant, some of it's really old, some of it is empty files, old application setup files, games, employee photographs. When we try to explain that to senior management, to the stakeholders in the organization, it's really hard for them to comprehend because it's out of sight and out of mind. And so they really have a hard time seeing how big the problem is and why they should spend money on it or take action.
Hey Russ, it's Rich.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I just wanted to add in was on that point, I think one of the other things is ironically the size of the problem. These days, the file shares you're talking about are enormous things, and it actually makes it really hard to see the wood for the trees. And so I think your point about seeing how big the problem is actually part of the problem as well. How do you actually get your hands around the sheer scale of data that modern corporates are now dealing with?
Yeah, absolutely. And the other point is, if you don't know what's in there, then how do you know what risk that represents for the organization? So last year, I wrote a paper entitled, Not If, But When You Get Hacked, Measuring and Proactively Managing Risk. And in that paper, and you'll notice on the sidebar here, in the webinar, there's a tab called Handouts, and one of the handouts, there's 4 handouts there, and one of the handouts is this paper. I actually go through and identify some of those risks and try to put some dollar figures around based on some of the research that I did that indicates that the risks that are facing organizations. And some of those are, like I have here on this slide, intellectual property and sensitive corporate data, legal hold and e-discovery risk. What if I don't know what's in these file shares and I should be producing some of that information in response to an e-discovery request and I don't? There's risk associated with that. And clearly, if there's a data breach and I have no idea of what is in that repository, that corporate file share, could offer a huge amount of risk when I have to remediate that data breach. And when I wrote this paper, the other point that I made that I think is important is it's not just the bad guys trying to get in. When I say not if, but when you get hacked, I'm talking about all data breaches. And some of those data breaches, the weakest link is the employees who unintentionally make a mistake that can simply lose or breach some information. One of the studies that I saw last year that was quite interesting, it was finished up last year, and they did a study in the UK of laundries and dry cleaners, and they found that 22,000 USB thumb drives were left at dry cleaners. And they were able to return almost half of those, but there were over 10,000 that were never returned to their original owners. And what information was on there? Now, that wasn't a bad guy trying to get in through the building. It was actually somebody inadvertently taking information out, forgetting about it when it was in their pocket. So the other challenge is, and we've seen this in a few of the recent high-profile breaches, is it can be an internal hacker or actor who compromises security also. And where do we start? So when we talk about these corporate file shares, one of the things that we need to think about is, when we think about the risk to the organization, is these biggest contributors, which is toxic, redundant, and obsolete, trivial files, what we'll call e-trash, and hidden sensitive data. There's some cases where there'll be files that were shared that have all kinds of personal data on it or credit card information, and it's been forgotten and it's sitting there, just sitting there, waiting to be compromised. And sometimes, like I said, it could be an internal person who just makes a mistake.
And that's a fair comment, Russ, actually, if I can butt in there for a second. We spend our time analyzing data in corporate file shares, and one particular case we came across in a very recent past was where a very well-meaning guy doing his job in the IT team managed to take an image of a laptop and move it to an open file share, and that contained a whole range of personal data from a range of staff in the business. And I think the point being here that not only are there issues with the mistake that the guy made, unwittingly or otherwise, but the business had no way of detecting that had happened, and in fact that data had been lying there for several months, and no one was any the wiser, at least from the corporate perspective, and they had no idea of who may have had access to that environment, apart from knowing that it was open, that everybody could have taken a poke around in there. And so I think there's there's an argument there for not only the management required to ensure and help people like that ensure they don't make those errors, but also how do you keep an eye on the data to ensure that even if someone does make those errors, you can pick up and handle the problem and resolve the risk as quickly as possible.
Yeah, absolutely. It's really important to get a warning or some sort of an alert that says, warning, warning, somebody's dropped in some really sensitive data into an open spot. It's almost like taking a file with everybody's personal data on it and just leaving it on a desk in the break room at the office. It's exactly the same kind of thing.
Yeah, and of course you'd think that people would say something in that latter example, Russ, but with the volume and scale of electronic data out there, there's no way that people are in a position to do that unless they've got some deliberate processes, I think, put in place in the organisation to prevent or to help that alerting system.
Yeah, absolutely. And much of the data residing in these corporate file shares is considered dark data, and we're going to talk a little bit more about that in a few minutes. But there was an Osterman research white paper that concluded the vast majority of data accumulating within a typical organization is unstructured and usually uncontrolled and managed by individual employees. And so this goes back to somebody sticking something on the file share, forgetting about it, and then all of a sudden it's just another piece of risk that exposes the organization. And the paper also suggested this data to be considered dark data because it's invisible and not easily accessible by the company. And like you said, Rich, Part of that is because of the volumes. We just are dealing with such large volumes, not only in size, the size of the files, but also the volume of the files. It's one thing when you have 10 or 100, but when you start looking at millions of files on these file shares, how do you sort through that? It's humanly impossible. And this problem is pervasive throughout the enterprise. This was a study that was done by the corporate governance, or the CGOC, and I had this in my paper, and as you can see here, almost 70% of information from a study that they did, almost 70% is debris and redundant, obsolete, and trivial files. And really, if you look at this, you roughly had about 31% that were really important information for the organization. And this study was done back in 2015.
One thing we know, Russ, I have to say, whether those percentages have changed or not, the volume of the data since 2017, what is it? It's likely to at least have doubled, if not more, in that intervening period.
Right. It goes back to the old, if you look at Moore's law and the exponential growth in power and capacity of the microchips, famous Moore's law. Well, I think we've followed the same curve, and we keep exponentially growing in the volume of information. Another study that was done by Veritas last year, Veritas Technologies, surveyed over 2,500 respondents from 22 countries, so it's a pretty good sample size. And in that study, they found that only 15% of the data was mission critical or business critical. And then you can see here some percentages, 48% tagged or classified, and they estimated 33% of what they had tagged and classified as rot, and then another 52% dark data. So when you look at this, the problem gets quite large. This hidden data, and a lot of the corporate file share information lives in that dark data area, really down below the surface where nobody's really looking at it. The other thing that was quite interesting in that study is the percentages of these different percentages of information that are being stored, the number of employees storing information, and our staff are treating these corporate file shares like a landfill, like a digital landfill. They're storing photos. This scares me. They're storing their own personal identifications and legal documents in these corporate file shares. Oh, I'll take a picture of my driver's license and put it on my file share because it'll be safe there. Music. So this is a risk for the company because a lot of times the music that's being stored there is potentially unlicensed. And so how do they protect themselves against copyright violations?
I'd add to that if I can, Russ.
Yeah.
We were working with a fire headquarters in the UK, and we discovered a British artist, Robbie Williams. I don't know if anybody knows him on the call today, but we found the entire works of Robbie Williams and his associated performances on one individual's file share. And I guess the point being here, not only was there a bunch of copyright issues with it, but when we ran the numbers, this individual's personal music collection was costing the business about $2,000 every year just to store on his behalf. And if you extrapolate that across the business and move out to media and games and any number of other personal pursuits on data, you can see where that's going.
Yeah, so the study also identified social content, media, and videos and games. I'm gonna back up a copy of my video game, but video, as you just mentioned, Rich, video is enormous in volume, and so now all of a sudden I'm eating up, hundreds and hundreds of gigabytes of storage, and it's videos that belong to end users or staff who've uploaded them. So once again, some of those videos might represent some type of risk, but they also have a storage cost. And then the other problem, I mentioned this earlier, but I really want to highlight this. In large organizations, when staff leave the company, where the common practice is that each user, each person has their own file share where they can store information, when they leave us these nice little gift boxes that just sit there. And in most organizations, they tend to sit there for quite some time because they don't have a methodical process for sunsetting those personal or employee file shares. So all of a sudden you start looking across a large enterprise and you may have tens of thousands of these orphaned, I'll call them orphaned file shares sitting out there. Nobody knows what's in them, nobody's taking care of them, and then all of a sudden one day there might be some highly risky information being stored in one of those, and somehow the scenario that you mentioned before, Rich, an administrator makes a mistake, opens it up, and all of a sudden somebody just happening across it comes across some highly sensitive information that was stored in one of these orphan file shares. So we want to avoid the gift scenario.
Well, there's another point, gifts and presents, I guess, Russ, you talked about people stumbling across it. If you return to your point about hacking and breaches, I think it was enough evidence in the Sony case that one of the biggest problems with the leaks in the Sony case was that there was a bunch of data that really shouldn't have been there at all. And so people could be deliberately looking for these presents and gifts, as you say, alongside those that just stumble across it as well.
That's a good point. That's especially true when you think about the fact that based on the current culture we have, at least here in the U.S., with some of the media outlets, when they're able to find this kind of information, they're handsomely rewarded for providing it to one of these news organizations so that they can break the story. So they have an incentive for poking around in some cases. Well, besides the risk and some of these other challenges that I've talked about, there are some real costs associated with these risks also. And this is based on the 2017 Poneman study, cost of breach study in the United States, and they found the average cost for each lost or stolen record containing sensitive and confidential information was $225. And when they did this study across several large organizations, mid to large organizations, they found based on the average number of records, so the average number of or the range of the breach number of records ranged from 5,500 to around 99,000. And you start looking at it, and based on the average number of records lost, that represents 7.35 million. So we're talking real money here when there's a breach and you've got to go through and remediate that breach. And a lot of people will ask, well, where do those costs from? In some cases, those costs come from having to provide credit monitoring protection for individuals where their personally identifiable information's been breached. A lot of it's investigative costs. It just depends. There might be fines associated with it, and a lot of the states are starting to clamp down and put some teeth in their cybersecurity laws. New York State has a new cybersecurity law, and if you're doing business in New York State around the financial services, insurance, and those industries, definitely want to take a look at the New York State cybersecurity law. The other thing that's interesting is the root causes of data breach that came out of that study. And just over half were malicious or criminal attack, the bad guys trying to get in or somebody getting inside and operating in a criminal way. But just under half are system glitches and human error. And so in many cases, those system glitches are those mistakes made by administrators. And when you start looking at this, the risk is not just the bad guy coming, the barbarians coming over the gate, but it is also poor training and also system errors or human error inside of the organization. So having that information there just really makes it risky when we don't know what's in those repositories. And there again, based on that study and the ranges, there's the potential exposure in dollars, anywhere from 1.2 million to 6.4 million. So this really represents a real risk in dollars. So one of the things I talk about in the Kill Your File Shares white paper, which is one of the resources you can download here in the webinar, is a roadmap giving you some practical steps of how you can move forward and start addressing this challenge. And so one of the first steps is executive buy-in and education, trying to shine a light on and help quantify and educate executives and senior stakeholders to understand what that problem looks like that we talked about earlier, that's hidden and in many cases hard to comprehend because of the volume of the information and how pervasive the problem is. And so one of the ways you can do that is you could share the white paper that I wrote. I wrote that as a tool for folks to use to help their stakeholders really begin to understand the problem and understand some of the risks. One of the other things you can do is you can create a presentation and highlight those risks and educate them on why this is something they should be doing. Let's say that you've got the education going and you've begun to get some interest. Well, now it's time to create a proposal, create a project proposal. And we don't have to boil the ocean or try to eat the elephant all at once. One of the things we can do is we can find a stakeholder in the organization that's really motivated or is sitting on top of a lot of risky information in file shares and choose them as a champion to put together a proposal, and let's do a project and show the others in the organization what we find and what the potential risk is for the rest of the organization based on a beginning project. So at this point, the next couple of steps that I have in the roadmap that I put into the white paper are really related to some of the things that Rich is going to show us. And so I'm going to hand it over to Rich Hale and let him show you what we're talking about. And there
Russ,
you go,
thanks
Rich.
for that. Rich, while you get set up here, I just want to take a quick second to mention so everybody, if you have questions for either Russ or Rich at the end of this webinar, please feel free to, at any time, post your question in the Questions tab in the taskbar, okay? And if you do that, we'll see it, and I'll make sure to answer to ask them all questions that time permits at the end, okay? With that, Rich?
Yeah, thanks, Pat. Can you see my screen okay?
Yeah, it looks good.
Awesome, and thanks for the introduction there, Russ. I guess what's really important when you talk about human error, Russ, one thing that always springs to mind is a quote I got from a Gartner friend, a lady called Deb Logan, who's been on this scene for some considerable time. She coined the phrase "people and technology got us into this problem, and only people and technology can get us out of the problem." And so, what I'm going to do over the next 20-25 minutes is introduce Active Navigation's file analysis software, Discovery Center, as one of the technical pieces required to help you shine light on that dark data. And really the aim of the software is to do exactly that, to give you a top-down view of file shares and other unstructured data sources, and enable you to really address the particular issues that you raised, Russ. The e-trash, the rot, the redundant, obsolete, and trivial, and how you can deal with those problems at scale. Duplicative data and potential strategies for handling that, and at least for the scope of this discussion, dealing with sensitive data and picking out sensitive data, potential sensitive data from the enormous scope of unstructured data that's sitting in the trash that you showed on the first screen. So let me introduce Discovery Center to everybody. It's on the screen here. It's Active Navigation's foundational product that provides a range of different tools and really is aimed at supporting information technology professionals, records managers, giving the tools to shine a light on dark data. Before I move on and talk through the features of the product, it's worth saying that the people that use our software aren't end users. The problem with governing information, I think, often stalls when you ask end users to do the governance job for the business. And whilst many are well-meaning and understand the benefits of doing that, the long story short is we're all busy. And when you ask a user to tag a file or do other governance or record-related type jobs, they're going to fail to do it 9 times out of 10. And so the point about Discovery Center is it empowers records and information professionals to work with the data without getting users involved necessarily. So the types of people that use our software are information governance teams, IT teams, records management teams, and the like. And I think the first thing point I'd make here, if I move across and talk about the network map, what Discovery Center does, it deploys behind your firewall and is designed to discover the content in any unstructured repository. And I think the point I'd make here is, whilst we've talked about file shares today, there's a whole range of new repositories coming onto the scene which are offering similar, if not greater, challenges, and arguably can be darker than the file share. For example, organizations are wrestling with file sync and share products, such as, for example, Dropbox, which users and businesses are filing data on in the cloud, and that can be really hard for organizations to keep track of. So Discovery Center can connect to all sorts of environments. In this particular demonstration, you can see I'm working with an Exchange environment in Office 365, a couple of file shares, a G Suite, G Drive for Google Drive setup, and also SharePoint. And what organization doesn't have SharePoint? Frankly, what SharePoint does, unless it's really well managed, is provides this amazing space for people to hide information, not deliberately, but in a file share, what you can do, you can create files, you can create folders. That's all you can do. In SharePoint, there are a huge number of ways of building out that landfill, and so it becomes a repository that we're used to working with all the time. I think the other point to make is that with Discovery Center, it's possible to begin to attach costs to locations as well. So you can see here I've got some storage tiers set up on my data, and that enables organizations to begin to attribute costs and returns to the data that we're working with and that we discover. It's important to note, I think, that whilst if you roll back the clock to 6, 7, 8 years ago, cost was a massive issue. Whilst the cost of storage has dropped considerably, the cost of properly managed and protected storage has dropped less fast, even with the advent of cloud-based storage environments. And with the scale of data that organizations are dealing with, those costs still remain considerable. And when you're working with unstructured data, it really is quite important you can apply a metric to your data where you need to. So what does Active Navigation's Discovery Center do? As I said, we go out, we discover the unstructured data on environments such as this, and we index that data. One of the key differences between us and some of our competition is that we're agentless. We reach out from a Windows server with a SQL database in the back end, and we discover the data in all these environments. So I'm showing you here our indexes page, and you can see each of the locations that I've got what we call under management. I've got a range of my file shares, I've got my 365 environment, my Exchange, a bunch of bulk data, and it's really important that when you address this data, you do so with a policy in mind. And so when you discover data using Discovery Center, you can see you deploy a range of different configurations, and the configuration provides a set of definitions or rules by which Discovery Center will analyze the content. And at this point, I think it's important to mention the requirement for defensibility in what you do with your data. Later on, I'll show you in our reporting that Discovery Center not only discovers the content, but provides you with the tools to actually take action on the content as well. So if we find some trash, we're going to provide the tools to enable you to delete that content and remove it from circulation. And at that point, you really need to do so defensively and account for things like legal hold and account for good process as well. And so these configurations provide a different set of rules to enable you to complete different tasks. So in this case, you can see my bulk cleansing rules are deployed to these indexes here, and those provide me with the tools to identify trash, to identify duplication and the like, and address those. And then at the top here, I've got a bunch of shares which have what I call my all rules demonstration, which enables me to show a range of different use cases. If I just crack open one of these configurations, let me describe to you what I mean by a rule. We spend a lot of time out in the market dealing with real problems, working with real file shares, real environments, and we've developed a range of definitions and rules that enable you out of the box to start attacking the problem. So, for example, what Discovery Center is doing is gathering together metadata and analyzing the contents of files in order to classify the data according to some rule. So in this particular case, I've deployed a rule called ROT, redundant, obsolete, and trivial, and I'll show you later on how this highlights data that's potentially can be removed because it's trash. Further on, we provide rules for things like sensitivity. So you'll all be aware, I'm sure, of the range of imperatives upon businesses, especially since the Sony breach, but also in response to a range of regulation for dealing with data sensitivity. And so you can see here rules for social security numbers, credit card detection, and any number of other capabilities. And I think the important thing to note about Discovery Center and of course other file analysis tools potentially is it can be adapted to a wide range of use cases, and most importantly must be tailored to reflect your organization's policy. I think it's important to stress here that we're not about blowing away content arbitrarily, but these rules need to reflect your business policies, for example, acceptable use policies, privacy policies, and the like, and they're all picked up and codified in these rules.
Hey, Rich, quick question. This is Russ.
Yeah.
So an organization, let's say they're creating a new product and they want to keep it under wraps until they're ready to debut the product. I guess they could set up some rules to look for information that might contain some special or some unique information around that, correct?
Well, absolutely. When you think about it, Russ, the attributes that would provide you with those sorts of enable you to identify that sort of data are not really much different from the social securities, the credit card numbers, and other definitions. And so, whilst we normally deliver the capabilities for privacy and the like, our customers frequently extend Discovery Center and add on their own rule definitions for things like ITAR, for intellectual property, for records identification, for contract identification, and all those are classes of that valuable data that needs to be identified, in contrast to the ROT that needs to be ideally taken out of circulation.
Okay, great.
And to that point, Discovery Center, it's worth pointing out, Discovery Center operates in three particular ways. We work with a SCIM, which is designed to cover an enormous amount of data very fast. In general, Discovery Center will skim and discover the metadata across between 15 and 20 terabytes of data every day at least. And that's producing records on around 20 million files every day. And we use those to cover large enterprise deployments and deal with things like trash and ROT and the like. And right the way through duplication down to text content analysis, Discovery Center is capable of looking inside documents and running the rules that I've been talking about, that Russ has been talking about, to identify both risky data and valuable data so it can be acted on and retained appropriately. As is always the case with these demonstrations, we all begin to have too much fun. So it's looking at the time now, it's worth me moving on to our reporting, which is really where the rubber hits the road. So with the organization deploying the Discovery Center, I think it's important to note that they generally do so in two ways. First of all, to attack a particular project, and a project will be involved in getting one's arms around the initial problem. And Russ mentioned earlier on that getting associated with a particular business unit, with a stakeholder or information owner that has this particular problem, the first project is often beneficial to attack their data and provide them with results based upon their needs. And then later on, once you've built out and develop the policies on your trash data and your sensitive data, Discovery Center can grow to keep a grip of your data on an ongoing basis. And the ongoing basis enables you to monitor things like that leak sensitive data we spoke about earlier on, where Discovery Center routinely indexes all of the in-scope content and provides alerts according to what is found. Discovery Center can be configured to enable you to report in a range of different ways. So we can report on any one of these locations at any level of detail we choose to. So I can drill the right way down and look at the personal drives, the live drives, or look at G Suites or SharePoint as I see fit. And as you can see on the right-hand side, our overview responds accordingly. or I can slice the data up into different contexts. And this is really important. When you're dealing with any of these cases, you really need to deal with the business data in context. And whilst there are ways in which you can deal with the data arbitrarily across the whole environment, very often you'll find yourself dealing with meaningful chunks of data. So we can use what are called areas of interest to slice the data up for example, the facilities or the HR team, and provide those teams data in context. I think the other point to make is Discovery Center scales really well. I'm here demonstrating across about 11 million objects. You can see in my all data area of interest here, I have about 11 million objects. This is running on my dual-core laptop with a SQL Server in the back end, and so the resource requirements I have here are pretty light, which means we can handle hundreds of terabytes at a time, and enable us to address truly enterprise scale problems too. So let's look at some reports then and reason about what Discovery Center does when the rubber hits the road, as I said. These saved views are handy bookmarks for reports that are frequently used in any organization, and if anyone used Discovery Center will build up over time. Discovery Center provides an enormous number of metrics across things like containers, that is the folders and the way files are shared, the extensions and the modified dates and the like, all the basic information. But where we really are unique is about enabling, using the rules I showed you earlier on, Discovery Center to classify data so that that data lines up against a particular policy. And so we've mentioned ROT a bunch of times here. Here's my ROT rule. This particular rule here, you can see, is set up on all of my data. So this one's actually deployed globally. And you can also see here I've got some people subscribed as reviewers to my ROT policy. And what this means is whenever our analysis hits files that are classified as ROT, these people will receive a notification in their email or in the user interface that enables them to click on a link and go and examine the ROT report. So if I do that, we can talk about what the ROT report looks like. And all of Discovery Center's reports work in very similar ways. That is, we provide you data on the information on the data we've classified, a range of classification categories, and the ability to act. These here are examples of rules that have been deployed with customers before. So along the bottom here are my policy are my classification tags, and they're focused, as I said, around trash in this particular case. You can see, as I said earlier on, we have about 11 million files in this data set, and my data's aging. When you build a demo data, it sticks static for some time, and so you can see my aging data categories are actually pretty large. In this case, in my sample data here, I have 4.7 million files, which constituted obsolete user data. So this is a class of data where the users have left the organization, and that is Discovery Center can't work out the user against Active Directory, and that these files are over 5 years old. And Russ talked about gifts and presents. These are examples of the gifts and presents that Russ was talking earlier on.
One of my orphans.
Exactly. And I think the point to make here, Russ, is if you're going to deal with this as an enterprise basis, you need to be able to act on this data at bulk. Otherwise, dealing with ROT's not worth your while. And so whilst I offer up here any one of these rules as a potential for what our listeners to work with, every single one of these needs to be run by the business's legal counsel, by their privacy, by their businesses, to check that these rules make sense and are deployable by the business. And so here I have an example, as I say, obsolete user data. We've got named films. We were talking about copyrighted. Now this is a very small number of files, but with films, it has a significant percentage of my data taken up in volume size. And we could go on. We could talk about any of these, and you will note there's an an H, an L, and an M. This is the risk that the business has assigned to this particular rule, and they'll analyze the rule and they'll determine that anything with an H, which is they're highly confident on, they'll enable and authorize people to act on directly. So let's say for example, we want to work on the obsolete user data, and actually they need to be pushed away to quarantine because the IT team have already have a process for imaging this data. They just never cleaned it up. Discovery Center lets you action this content. So let's remind ourselves, we're dealing with 4.7 million files here, and what Discovery Center is capable of doing is taking this content and acting on it. I remind you that the people using the tool are those in the central records team, in IG teams and the like, and that this rule is not to be used unless you have policy backing it up. So we're doing this as part of a defensible process. And Discovery Center lets you provide an opportunity to quarantine the data, which is probably one of our most popular options. Enables the Discovery Center to move the data to a quarantine location where it sits for 3, 6, 9, or 12 months until it can be finally disposed of. And generally that kind of just provides this kind of grace period which enables people to shout and recover data if it's been inappropriately actioned. To that point, though, I guess it's worth noting that in the entire time I've been engaged in these type of activities, we've only ever had 2 requests for recovery of data in this way. In each case, when the user that requested the data that apparently had been inappropriately removed, each case when the user was presented with a request for change by IT to recover the data, they decided it really wasn't that important anyway. And so, you know, with decent policy and understanding the data that you have, you know, this really enables action in bulk. I think the other thing to note is that when you clean up files in any enterprise repository, you're likely to leave behind what we call empty containers, or in file share parlance, empty folders. And so uniquely, Discovery Center enables you to clean up the empty folders behind it too. So not only are we removing the files from circulation, we're also cleaning out the containers that are left behind too. Finally, as I said, it's really important, it's critical, not really important, it's critical that this action is defensible. Because you're acting against a policy, Discovery Center keeps an audit trail of all these actions, file by file, failure by failure, success by success, and so you can enter an annotation against any particular action, and that gets recorded in our audit trail. And so you have a full picture that can be translated and mapped back against your policies in order to complete the defensible life cycle. So that's the kind of introduction really to our reports. Let me move on and talk about a couple of other use cases that tend to come into our file share killing type discussions. If I head back to my save views, which if you recall are the reports I use frequently, let's address the issue of duplication, which, you know, quite honestly I find a frustrating issue because duplication is not as easy to handle as many people might believe. So Discovery Center analyzes content for duplication using what's called a SHA-256 hashing algorithm. It's a highly complicated cryptographic technique that enables us to identify files that are identical. And when I say identical, I mean down to the last bit and byte, even if their names are different. And what's unique, or one of the things that's unique about the software, is that in use of the SHA-256 algorithm, we can confidently deploy these hashes and duplicate analysis across hundreds of millions of files without fear of being wrong, frankly. The other thing that's unique about the software is we do what's called a master analysis, which enables us to detect and identify of a group of files that are identical, which ones should be retained. And what I've not shown you before in these reports is the ability to drill down to file level. So if whilst I'm talking, I'll click on the file list, I've selected the duplicate report, and I've asked that Discovery Center return the masters, the file duplicates, those are identical, and the content duplicates that only vary by their metadata, so that you can review the information and get some confidence. And again, whilst you should be dealing with duplication in bulk if you're going to be efficient in the work, the purpose of this file list view is to enable you to examine the files and gain confidence in the rules that are being deployed, so that you can act on them accordingly. And in common with any webinar, of course, my software goes into a go slow mode whilst I'm building this report. Here we go. So each of these sections is a clustered group of files that are identical or identical in their content. In each case, you have a master and a range of duplicates. And you can see down the list here, we're showing you again the master and a range of duplicates right the way down. And I have some clusters of 2 down here, which are file duplicates. And you can see, even though the file names are different, you'll identify that in fact their sizes are identical. And again, hand on heart, these files are indeed identical. And we're very confident about that. In fact, the statistics are that you'd win the national lottery 3 times in a row before this duplicate analysis was incorrect. So importantly, because we've identified a master, you can begin to become confident about the way you execute on this data. Per all of our reports, if I take out the masters, which of course we need to retain, I get the option to delete. And differently from the previous reports, Discovery Center enables us to create some shortcuts. Now this is a provision which enables us to create a Windows shortcut, replacing any of the removed files with a shortcut to the remaining master. This is important, of course, if you're concerned about users losing track of folders, of files. But of course, one of the other problems with the shortcut creation is it does leave what I would call trash across the environment. So I would use this particular feature with care. That said, where duplication really works well is when you're comparing two repositories, and Discovery Center is capable of comparing a repository of record with a file share. And what's important about that is when you have a repository of record, that's the data you'd really want to keep hold of. And so if you have duplicates lying around in a file share, then they're far easier to dispose of, because they are the same, they are identical to files in your repository of record. Generally, they're courtesy copies held by users who are perhaps struggling with the ECM or the like, and perhaps you can remove those based upon the fact that they've not been touched in the last year. They're an old courtesy copy that's not been dealt with. So Discovery Center provides you with a wide range of abilities for addressing duplication. Again, keeping on the time, there's one more case I wanted to show you in Discovery Center, which is focused on sensitive data, and I listed some of those rules for you earlier on. Most of our customers right now are buying the software in two ways. First of all, they're looking at their trash, but alongside the trash, they want to deal with, as I said, data sensitivity. This report works in very much the same way as the ROC report, but this time we're classifying data based upon the text contents of the files. We've run the rules I showed you earlier on across the text contents of those files, and we've classified them accordingly. You can see here, using this demonstration data, I have bank account details, credit card information, information with keywords about disabilities or human resource management matters, right the way down to social security numbers. When you deal with sensitive data, you're not expecting enormous returns like the 4.7 million I found in my ROT, although it is possible. Because you're reviewing this data in context, we usually expect our customers to deal with to go through a review process too. So I can select any one of these categories. In this case, let's talk about social security numbers, and we'll drill into the file list. In this case, you can see that my demo data consists of a range of staff databases copied around to build out the numbers. Each of these staff databases have been classified as having two aspects of sensitivity: the social security number and the UK equivalent, which is the national insurance number. If I go down the list here, we found some employment contracts, and these guys all have social security numbers as well. So let me just open up one of these guys to take a look. Now, whilst it's possible, if you have the appropriate privileges, to open up the contract directly, when you're reviewing this sort of data, you really don't want to be routing through file by file. And so Discovery Center provides you a summary of what we found. The metadata, and in this case, we can already see this is in somebody's P drive, per our discussion earlier on. Uniquely, Discovery Center provides a summary of the document too. Now, in this case, I happen to know that this file is pretty small and hasn't got a great deal of text, but nevertheless, we've managed to scrape out some summary data about the content, which, without opening this document, hopefully you agree, enables me to qualify and confirm that indeed this looks like an employment contract. And lastly, amongst all the other metadata that Discovery Center's gathered, it's identified the employee number inside the file, and that's a little bit like the contract number or the intellectual property details that Russ was talking about earlier on. We've picked out the employment number in this case. We've classified the file as relating to social security number. For demo purposes, we've actually stored the social number itself here, and the fact that it has some key terms in it as well. So these things come together and enable Discovery Center to classify the data accordingly. And when involved in the review process, you have a bunch of choices. A lot of our customers choose to mark the data. So I have a sensitive markup category here, and I can review it according to whether it's sensitive or not. And all file analysis type tools can make errors, and so this review would also involve marking potentially the file as not sensitive for later triage. Alternatively, we can actually use another feature of Discovery Center, which is to migrate these files to a quarantine environment. And this is slightly different from the one I showed you earlier on. We might be pushing this across to SharePoint, for example, for a particular individual to review in detail. So we can pick our destination location. Let's move these employee data over to this employees area here. And I can pick a bunch of migration options, including writing these containers writing these files into containers based upon the nature of the file I've found. Lastly, of course, I have to put in my policy detail. And the point here that not only Discovery Center capable of deleting files, it's also capable of moving files around. So you can quarantine, take reviews, and deal them in ways appropriate to the data. And if I hit migrate here, remembering earlier on the range of repositories that we're connected to, Discovery Center will actually do the job. It will take these files, it will pick them up, it'll move them to the destination location and ensure that the appropriate metadata is mapped across so that they can be reviewed. First, they're taken out of circulation, and secondly, they're available for review perhaps by a third party. With a few minutes to go, I think the last point to make is in any information project, it's really important that where you can, you provide evidence to stakeholders of the benefits you're bringing and the progress you're making. And so Discovery Center supports dashboarding too. And the idea here, and I'm using Excel to demonstrate this, but Discovery Center's management reporting enables you to apply any of your chosen BI tools. So for example, a Power BI, a Crystal Reports, even a Splunk can be attached to this database. And we allows you to build a dashboard of the state of play. And so, you have your top line statistics here. We're tracking costs from our cost allocation at the beginning, and Discovery Center is also tracking change over time. And so we can see how the project proceeds over time. If you have managers that love self-service, then of course these filters enable you to slice and dice the data accordingly. You can begin to do things like heat map, and so here we have all of my sensitive data types across the top with each of my locations and business units down the side. And I come from a background where we're very much taught that what gets measured gets done, and to my mind providing these sorts of metrics to the relevant information owners really provides a very clear insight into the dark data that Russ was talking about earlier on and promotes action. Lastly, of course, once your stakeholders support and sign up to action, Discovery Center actually tracks that action as we go. And so you can see the sensitive data returns here I found for credit card, for HR, have been consistent month on month on month. But in November, we have a record of some remediation. And so in this particular case, the business has actually taken action on the results and disposed of the appropriate content. And with that, I've already had far too much fun. I need to allow Russ the chance to pick back up. So, Russ, I'm going to hand back across to you, sir.
All right. Well, the other point I was going to make that's really interesting, Rich, is make sure we're seeing the screen great, is that you could also take those sensitive file counts and start doing some estimates based on some of the data that I pulled out from some of the studies for the white paper, and just come up with indicative risk costs to help, to help senior executives and stakeholders understand what the potential risk is that's been reduced besides the storage costs.
Absolutely. Attaching these numbers, I think, really helps bring things to light.
So one of the things, just to highlight, that was part of the roadmap that I identified was, okay, so we've done some remediation. Let's make sure that we reinforce the message, and we're going to have to do some training and re-education. So one of the challenges is we need to start training folks to prevent them from using those corporate file shares as dumping grounds. And in some case, we might just close them down so that they're read-only and they can't add anything else. But there is a change that needs to be made in the organization to help people really get on board with stopping putting information in there. And one of the other things that is really interesting, and Rich kind of alluded to this, but the real prize is preventing this from happening again. So one of the things that's really great about the solution Rich just demonstrated is we can have that proactively monitor the repositories that have been set up and alert when somebody dumps something in there that shouldn't go in there. So if we have some sensitive data or information that matches one of those rules, you can have an alert, right, Rich?
You're absolutely right. I'd say information governance, not just for one project, but for life, and so you need that monitoring to keep on top of the issue, because no matter how well you do in your initial project, those pesky users are always going to find ways of working around your measures, and so you need to keep an eye on what's out there.
So now that we have success killing file shares in that one project that we started with maybe a champion, now let's go tackle the other sources, and that's the other benefit, is you can take that success and use it across the organization and really start making a big difference, especially when you start looking at all the places that this information, this risky information, could be hidden. And besides reducing the risk, we're also increasing the quality of the information that people are relying on. So I know we're close to the end already. Boy, an hour goes by fast. But it was great. And here's our contact information, and I'll hand it back over to you, Patrick.
Yeah, thanks for that, Russ, and thank you, Rich. Guys, I hope that everybody here learned a lot today. Now, we did get a whole bunch of questions. Unfortunately, we are quite limited on time. So I think what we're going to do is actually send out responses to these questions with the handouts and with recording of this webinar as well. So all of that will be sent out following the webinar.
Yeah, and I apologize, Patrick. I obviously was having far too much time far too much fun at the time.
No worries, Rich. No worries. It was great stuff. So everybody, thanks for joining today. You'll be getting all this stuff from us soon. To those in the U.S., happy Thanksgiving.
Cheers, Patrick. See you.